Black soldier is denied first class, unaware he is a war hero. On a routine commercial flight from Afghanistan to America, a simple airline upgrade transforms into a viral moment that exposes the ugly face of modern discrimination. When decorated war hero Sergeant Marcus Wright takes his assigned first-class seat, he doesn't expect to fight another battle, this time not against enemy forces, but against deeply rooted prejudices in his own country. As tension builds at 35,000 feet, one question remains. In a world where heroes come in all colors, why do some still see the uniform but not the man who wears it? Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. The bustling international airport was alive with the cacophony of hurried footsteps, rolling luggage, and the occasional muffled announcement over the intercom. Among the sea of travelers weaving through the terminal, Sergeant Marcus Wright stood tall, his crisp camouflage military uniform and the duffel bag slung over his shoulder setting him apart from the crowd. His dark skin bore faint reminders of the relentless Afghan sun, and his fatigued posture betrayed the 15 months he had spent overseas. Despite his distinguished appearance, Marcus moved quietly, blending into the chaos of the terminal. All he wanted was a peaceful journey home. At the check-in counter, the clerk's expression shifted noticeably when she saw him. Her professional smile grew warmer, her tone more reverent. "Sergeant Wright, thank you for your service," she said, scanning his ticket. "It looks like someone has requested to give up their first-class seat for an active-duty military member. Congratulations, you've been upgraded." Marcus blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the unexpected gesture. "That's very kind of them," he replied, his voice tinged with hesitation. "But really, I'm fine with my original seat." The clerk shook her head with a smile. "Please, Sergeant, accept it. It's the least we can do to show our appreciation." He nodded reluctantly, unsure how to process such generosity. Moments like these were rare. Too often, his uniform attracted more judgment than gratitude. He adjusted his bag and made his way toward security, weaving through a crowd of travelers who barely gave him a second glance. Or, when they did, their eyes lingered just a moment too long. The terminal's energy was a mix of excitement and impatience. Families hugged tightly at their goodbyes, while business travelers huddled around their phones, typing furiously. For Marcus, the scene felt oddly foreign. After months in the stark, dusty deserts of Afghanistan, the fluorescent-lit airport and the mundane lives it contained felt surreal. At Gate B7, Rebecca Palmer, the head flight attendant for the flight, stood at her post. Her polished blonde hair was neatly pulled back into a flawless bun, her airline-issued uniform crisp and professional. Rebecca prided herself on her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to maintain a pristine demeanor, no matter the situation. As Marcus approached the gate, presenting his upgraded ticket, Rebecca's smile faltered. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for Marcus to notice. Her blue eyes darted to his uniform and then back to the ticket in her hand. "Good morning," Marcus said politely, extending his boarding pass. Rebecca hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the ticket longer than necessary. "One moment, please," she said, her tone cordial but edged with a subtle coolness. Behind her composed exterior lay a complex web of emotions. Just 3 months ago, Rebecca had been passed over for a coveted promotion to senior cabin manager. The position had gone instead to James Thompson, a black colleague with fewer years of service but a resume bolstered by leadership experience and a reputation for handling high-stakes situations with grace. The airline had justified their decision as part of an effort to create a more inclusive leadership team, but Rebecca had struggled to see it that way. To her, it felt like she was being punished for being too conventional, too ordinary. Marcus watched as Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line, her internal conflict playing out in subtle gestures. She finally scanned his boarding pass and handed it back. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice clipped but polite. "Thank you," Marcus replied, his tone steady despite the strange undercurrent in their interaction. As Marcus walked toward the jet bridge, Rebecca remained rooted at her station, watching his retreating figure with an unreadable expression. The sight of his uniform stirred something uncomfortable within her, not respect or admiration, but a prickling unease she couldn't quite place. Inside the first-class cabin, Marcus settled into his seat near the window. The leather upholstery was luxurious, a stark contrast to the hard metal benches and desert sand he had grown accustomed to. He placed his duffel bag carefully in the overhead compartment and sat down, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Passengers began trickling into the cabin, each one glancing briefly at Marcus before moving on. Most ignored him. A few offered polite nods. Marcus, accustomed to the duality of being both hypervisible and invisible, kept his focus on the view outside the window. As the cabin filled, Rebecca made her way down the aisle, conducting her routine pre-flight checks. Her sharp eyes scanned each row, her professional smile firmly in place. When she reached Marcus's row, her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. "Good morning, sir," she said, her tone measured. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" "No, thank you," Marcus replied, his voice calm and polite. Rebecca nodded and moved on, but the subtle tension between them hung in the air. What Rebecca couldn't see, what no one in the cabin could know, was the reason for Marcus's quiet urgency to return home. His wife Olivia was expecting their third child any day now. The doctors had advised him to stay in the military hospital for a few more days to recover from the injuries he had sustained during his final mission, but Marcus had insisted on an early discharge. The scars on his back, still healing, were a small price to pay for the chance to keep his promise to Olivia to be there for the birth. As the plane began boarding the last passengers, Rebecca paused in the galley, her mind racing. She thought back to the day she learned about her missed promotion. The announcement had been made during a staff meeting, and while James had humbly accepted the position, Rebecca had forced a smile through the disappointment that threatened to choke her. She had worked tirelessly for the airline, sacrificing time with her family and pushing herself to meet every performance metric. Yet, it hadn't been enough. Now, as she looked at Marcus, the resentment she had buried began to bubble to the surface. It wasn't his fault, she told herself, but the sight of his uniform, a symbol of authority and respect, stirred memories of her own perceived failures. What he didn't realize was that another battle was waiting for him, not on a distant battlefield, but at 35,000 feet in the air. Rebecca's lingering unease wasn't just about the promotion she had lost. It was about a deeper, more insidious fear, one that she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. And as the hours of the flight stretched ahead, that fear would collide with Marcus's quiet dignity in a way neither of them could have anticipated. What started as an ordinary flight would soon become a crucible, testing the mettle of both Rebecca and Marcus, and forcing them to confront truths about themselves and each other that they had long avoided. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the soothing hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin. In first class, passengers were settling into their luxurious seats, sipping drinks and scrolling through tablets. Marcus Wright sat quietly in his assigned seat, his posture relaxed but his eyes distant. His mind wandered back to his time in Afghanistan, the missions, the camaraderie, and the sacrifices. It was a relief to leave it all behind, at least for now. Rebecca Palmer, meanwhile, had not left Marcus's row for long. The professional smile she wore as part of her uniform had tightened, her polite demeanor overshadowed by an internal conflict she could no longer ignore. She approached Marcus for the third time since takeoff. "Excuse me, Sergeant," she said, her tone overly polite, as though compensating for her true feelings. "I noticed you seem a bit uncomfortable in this seat. Perhaps you'd prefer something more spacious in the economy cabin? There's more legroom near the emergency exit rows, and I'd be happy to arrange it for you." Marcus looked up from the book he had been reading, his dark eyes steady and calm. "Thank you, but I'm perfectly fine here," he replied. Rebecca hesitated, her fingers brushing the edges of her clipboard. "You know, first-class seating is usually reserved for our premium members. We try to ensure the best experience for all passengers." Her voice trailed off, the unspoken implication hanging heavy in the air. Marcus closed the book slowly and placed it on the tray table. His voice remained measured, devoid of confrontation. "I was upgraded to this seat by someone who wanted to show appreciation for my service. If there's an issue with that, perhaps you should take it up with the airline." Nearby passengers began to take notice of the interaction. In seat 2B, Linda Foster, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward slightly, her phone discreetly angled to record the exchange. Rebecca faltered for a moment, her professional composure slipping. "Of course not," she said, her tone clipped. "I was just trying to ensure your comfort." As Rebecca turned to leave, a voice interrupted the growing tension. "Is there a problem here?" The entire first-class cabin turned toward the source of the voice. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a decorated military uniform stood in the aisle. His presence was commanding, his expression firm yet approachable. Marcus looked up, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Colonel Harrison," he said, sitting up straighter. The colonel's face broke into a wide smile. "Sergeant Wright, I hardly recognized you without all the dust and sand. How are you, son?" Rebecca's face turned pale as she realized the man standing before her was no ordinary passenger. "You two know each other?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Know him?" Colonel Harrison let out a hearty laugh. "This man is a hero. Just a couple of weeks ago, he led one of the most daring rescue missions I've ever seen. His actions saved the lives of 12 soldiers, including mine." A hushed murmur spread through the cabin as passengers began to piece together the significance of the moment. Linda Foster, still recording, leaned closer. "He saved your life?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity and respect. Colonel Harrison nodded, his expression growing solemn. "We were deep in hostile territory, outnumbered and surrounded. Our position was compromised, and reinforcements couldn't reach us due to a sandstorm. Sergeant Wright took command, orchestrated a tactical retreat, and personally carried 2 injured soldiers for over 18 hours through enemy lines to get us to safety. He was injured himself, took 3 bullets to the back, but he refused medical attention until every single one of us was taken care of." The cabin fell silent, the weight of Harrison's words sinking in. Even Rebecca seemed momentarily stunned, her clipboard held limply at her side. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unused to such public praise. "It wasn't just me, sir," he said quietly. "The whole team made it possible." "That's humility for you," Harrison said, his tone warm but firm. He turned to Rebecca, his expression hardening. "But it seems not everyone here recognizes what this uniform stands for." Rebecca stammered, her professional facade cracking under the scrutiny. I wasn't questioning his service, Colonel. I was just what?" Harrison interrupted. "Suggesting that he doesn't belong here? That his place is in the back of the plane, not up here with the rest of us?" Linda Foster stood up from her seat, holding her phone firmly. "I've been recording this whole thing," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "My son is serving in Iraq right now, and I know how hard it is for these soldiers. The way this man has been treated today is unacceptable." Rebecca's face turned crimson, her eyes darting around the cabin as passengers began murmuring their disapproval. Linda continued, her voice rising. Sergeant Wright deserves more than just this seat. He deserves our respect, our gratitude. And he shouldn't have to fight another battle just to prove he belongs here. Rebecca took a step back, her confidence completely shattered. For the first time, she realized the depth of her bias and the impact it had on those around her. Colonel Harrison placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. Son, you've done more for this country than most people will ever know. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Passengers who had been silent before now voiced their support for Marcus. Some applauded, while others offered words of thanks and encouragement. Rebecca retreated to the galley, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. She felt the weight of judgment from the passengers, but more than that, she felt the sting of her own guilt. As the plane continued its journey, Linda Foster turned off her phone and looked at Marcus with a warm smile. Thank you for your service, Sergeant, she said. My son would be proud to serve under someone like you. Marcus nodded, his expression softening. Thank you, ma'am, and thank your son for his service as well. Little did any of them know, Linda's video would soon go viral, sparking a national conversation about prejudice and respect for veterans. And Rebecca Palmer, whose actions had triggered the confrontation, would find herself at the center of a storm she had never anticipated. The morning sun filtered through the blinds as Rebecca Palmer sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee untouched before her. Her phone buzzed incessantly, vibrating across the polished surface. She hesitated before picking it up, already dreading what she might see. Overnight, her world had turned upside down. A video from the flight had gone viral across social media platforms. Filmed by Linda Foster, it captured the tense interaction between Rebecca and Sergeant Marcus Wright. The hashtags #HonorOurHeroes and #FirstClassRespect were trending, and thousands of comments flooded in, most of them condemning Rebecca's behavior. Her heart pounded as she scrolled through the messages. Disgraceful treatment of a war hero. She should be fired immediately. This is what's wrong with society today. Rebecca's hands trembled. She hadn't realized the extent to which her actions would affect others, or herself. The airline had already reached out, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss the incident. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his modest living room, the sounds of his children's laughter filling the air. His wife, Olivia, glanced over at him, concern etched on her face. Have you seen this? She asked softly, handing him her tablet. Marcus watched the video, his expression unreadable. He sighed deeply. I didn't want this, he said. I just wanted to come home quietly. Olivia placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Maybe it's an opportunity, she suggested. People need to hear your story. By midday, news outlets had picked up the story. Reporters camped outside Rebecca's apartment building, and her name dominated the headlines. Flight attendant faces backlash after confrontation with war hero. At the airline's headquarters, executives convened an emergency meeting. The public relations director was the first to speak. We need to address this immediately. The public outrage is growing by the hour. The CEO nodded grimly. What's our recommended course of action? An internal investigation, replied the HR director. But given the severity and the evidence, we may need to consider terminating her employment. Back at her apartment, Rebecca received the dreaded call. We're placing you on administrative leave pending the investigation, the HR director informed her. Please refrain from speaking to the media. She sank onto her couch, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized the magnitude of her actions. Across town, Marcus agreed to appear on a prominent morning talk show. Seated across from the host, he appeared composed yet contemplative. Sergeant Wright, the host began, thank you for joining us. Can you share your perspective on what happened during your flight? Marcus took a moment before responding. I believe what occurred on that flight is a reflection of deeper issues in our society, he said. It's not about me, but about how we perceive and treat one another. Do you think the flight attendant's actions were discriminatory? The host pressed. I think there was a misunderstanding rooted in unconscious bias, Marcus replied thoughtfully. But I also believe in forgiveness and the power of education to bring about change. His response sparked a new wave of discussion online. Many praised his grace and humility, while others called for harsher repercussions for Rebecca. Later that day, Marcus received an unexpected call from the airline CEO. Sergeant Wright, we'd like to formally apologize for your experience, the CEO began. We are taking this matter very seriously. I appreciate that, Marcus said, but I'd like to make a request. Of course. Rather than terminating the flight attendant, I propose that she undergo comprehensive training on diversity, equity, and inclusion, he suggested. Let's turn this into an opportunity for growth. The CEO was taken aback. That's incredibly gracious of you. We'll certainly take that into consideration. Meanwhile, Rebecca sat alone, reflecting on her actions. Memories of her career flashed before her. The long hours, the missed family events, the promotion that slipped through her fingers. She realized she'd allowed her personal disappointments to cloud her judgment. Her phone rang, displaying an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered, Hello? Miss Palmer? This is Sergeant Marcus Wright. She was silent for a moment, shocked. How did you get my number? The airline provided it, he said gently. I wanted to reach out. She braced herself. I understand if you're calling to express your anger. I deserve it. Actually, Marcus replied, I'm calling to see how you're holding up. Tears welled up again. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry for how I treated you. There's no excuse. I appreciate your apology, he said sincerely. I wanted you to know that I don't hold any resentment. We all make mistakes. Rebecca was silent, overwhelmed by his compassion. I've spoken with the airline, Marcus continued. I asked them not to terminate your employment, but to provide an opportunity for education and growth. Why would you do that after how I treated you? She whispered. Because responding to negativity with negativity doesn't create change, he said. I believe in giving people a chance to learn and improve. The next day, the airline released a public statement. We acknowledge the incident involving one of our employees and Sergeant Marcus Wright. We are committed to addressing this matter appropriately. Both parties have agreed to work together to promote understanding and inclusivity within our company and the broader community. Rebecca was reinstated under the condition that she participate in and help develop a new diversity and inclusion training program. She embraced the opportunity, determined to make amends. Weeks turned into months as Rebecca immersed herself in the program. She attended workshops, engaged in open dialogues, and shared her experiences with colleagues. Marcus joined her in several sessions, offering his perspective and fostering meaningful conversations. One afternoon after a particularly impactful workshop, Rebecca approached Marcus. I can't thank you enough for giving me this chance, she said earnestly. You've taught me so much about empathy and understanding. He smiled. We're all on a journey. What's important is that we're moving forward. News outlets caught wind of their collaborative efforts, and the narrative began to shift. Headlines now read, From conflict to collaboration, a story of forgiveness and change. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. People were inspired by the transformation and the message that growth is possible when we choose compassion over condemnation. Linda Foster, the passenger who had filmed the original video, reached out to both of them. I never expected my actions to lead to all this, she admitted during a meeting, but seeing the impact it's had gives me hope. Rebecca nodded. Your decision to share the video was a catalyst. It forced me to confront parts of myself I'd been ignoring. Together, the three of them began advocating for broader conversations about bias, respect, and unity. They appeared on talk shows, participated in panel discussions, and contributed to articles. Rebecca's journey of self-discovery resonated with many who had struggled with their own biases. She received messages from people around the world thanking her for her honesty and vulnerability. One evening, after a successful seminar, Rebecca and Marcus sat in a quiet cafe. "Do you ever think about how a single moment can change everything?" she mused. "All the time," Marcus replied. "But it's what we do with those moments that defines us." She looked thoughtful. "I used to see the world in such a narrow way. Losing that promotion felt like the end of everything I'd worked for. I projected that frustration onto you without even realizing it." "We all have our battles," he said gently. "But empathy allows us to see beyond ourselves." Rebecca smiled softly. "You've taught me that. I hope to continue paying it forward." As time passed, the airline's new training program became a model for other companies. Employee satisfaction improved, and the company received accolades for its commitment to fostering an inclusive environment. Marcus returned to his duties but remained involved in advocacy work. His story served as a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the impact one person can have on another's life. Rebecca, now a vocal proponent for diversity and inclusion, found renewed purpose in her career. She mentored new employees, sharing her experiences and encouraging them to approach others with openness and respect. In the end, the incident that once threatened to destroy lives became a turning point that brought people together. Rebecca learned that acknowledging and confronting her biases was the first step toward personal growth. Marcus demonstrated that compassion could bridge divides and heal wounds. Their paths, once crossed by conflict, were now united in a shared mission to promote understanding and equality. Together, they proved that even in the face of adversity, positive change is possible when we choose to see the humanity in one another.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.